Hi, everybody. You may have seen my video recently on Richard Dawkins, critiquing some of his views on God and his most famous statements about his atheism and reasons he doesn't believe in God. If you missed that one, I'll put a link to it in the description below. But I also mentioned that I would probably do a similar video critiquing the ideas of Christopher Hitchens. So that's what I'll do in this video now. So Christopher Hitchens, I think he's an even slipperier customer than Richard Dawkins in a way. There's no question that Hitchens was a charismatic and witty public speaker with eloquent linguistic fluidity, good sense of humor. But in terms of philosophical and theological arguments, I thought he was actually even worse than Richard Dawkins. When you actually listen to what Christopher Hitchens says by way of his propositions, the arguments are incredibly shallow, overly simplistic, and usually non-engaging, really. Their faults he frequently attempted to mask with his well-known dismissive witticisms and bombastic evasions. Hitchens, he used well-constructed sentences to distort reality, to paint the kind of picture he wants. And then he used those distortions to argue in ways that everyone would agree with if his fabrications were accurate. This is another favorite trick of politicians, but it carries very little intellectual weight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick some statements that I know Christopher Hitchens said and I've seen in many of his videos, and I'm going to attempt to share the screen and talk you through them. And again, like the Dawkins comments, I hope no one will think I'm cherry picking some bad and unrepresentative examples of where they maybe misspoke or whether they weren't at their best. These are statements that are regularly uttered by Christopher Hitchens in a quite proud and confident way. So I think when we look at them, you'll hopefully agree that I'm trying to get Hitchens at what he thinks is his best. So let's just hit the screen option. And again, in my very low tech way, this is just a simple PowerPoint presentation. So let me move on to the first slide. So this is a typical example of where Hitchens is quite slippery, I would say. So let's push that. And that should move across. There we go. So this is the first. He says, religious belief is a totalitarian belief. It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep, who can who must indeed subject you to total surveillance around the clock, every waking and sleeping minute of your life. And I paired that with another of his well-known statements of a similar nature. The working assumption is that we should have no moral compass if we were not somehow in thrall to an unalterable and unchallengeable celestial dictatorship. What a repulsive idea. Now, if you know Hitchens at all, you'll know that he says those things quite often. But straight away, you'll notice Hitchens employs the same trick as Dawkins frequently does, in using words like totalitarian and slave, tyrannical, crime. He appeals to terms that everyone sees as negative and undesirable and uses them to paint a sort of metaphor-strewn Orwellian picture of religious people being slaves to a totalitarian dictatorship. In other speeches, he regularly contradicts this tenor by saying that the comfort blanket of religious belief is is mere wish fulfillment. So you'll notice he uses contradictory arguments to suit his cause on different occasions. If Christianity really were a tyrannical dictatorship, then it couldn't really be an idealized wish fulfillment, I would say, not a convincing one. So, and notice too that Hitchens uses the words dictator and tyranny interchangeably, falsely conflating them when they're really quite different words. Dictator means someone who possesses absolute power to rule. Its Latin origins, I think, are the one who gives orders, something like that. So whereas a tyrant, on the other hand, is a cruel and oppressive ruler. They're quite different. Christians know God as an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, and in calling the God Christopher Hitchens rejects, in calling that God a tyrant, he's just making up a false straw man God to knock down, in my view, fairly unimpressively. In terms of being a dictator, this is just an absurd rejection, really, from Hitchens, because if you think about it, if a dictator is one who possesses the power to govern, to give instruction under that governance, then if there's one ruler who we should want to dictate those instructions, it would be an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, a God who loves us, a God who cares about us, who has the power and knowledge to give us what we want and need. With our democratic mindset, we find it hard to imagine such a leader in terms of a kind of a political mandate. But if there really was a political party who understood what is best for humanity in an objective sense and had the facts at their disposal and the power to implement those wishes and make no mistakes in doing so, they are exactly the kind of party we would want to govern the country. Similarly, a God who has the properties of being all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing, and who is brilliant enough to give us free will and as Pascal said, the dignity of causality. He'd be precisely the dictator, so to speak, we'd all be looking for, someone who knows our wants and needs better than we do and is willing to help us achieve them. So that's a really bad argument, I think, from Hitchens, using words rather disingenuously to achieve his own ends in creating a straw man. So let's move on to the next one. So the essential principle of totalitarianism is to make laws that are impossible to obey. This makes a similar error to the first one, and it's kind of related. It's not only false. In fact, if one looks at totalitarianism on Earth, and if we use Hitchens' favorite example, which he often cites, of North Korea, then actually just the opposite is true. Totalitarian states make laws that are quite easy to obey. They just involve subjection to a totalitarian leader, which means being a dehumanized slave to an ignorant, repressive, manipulative, uncaring dictator who's largely a megalomaniacal abuser of human rights and largely morally unaccountable in his thoughts and deeds. That's a horrible life for the serf and morally ignoble for the oppressors. But totalitarianism makes laws that are not difficult to obey, actually. They're just unpleasant. They are certainly not impossible to obey, as Hitchens claims. If he thought it through a bit more carefully, he might have been led to consider that if they really are laws that are impossible to obey, then they would be impossible for a very profound reason, because they belong to a standard unobtainably higher than anything we could possibly create by ourselves. If the concepts of divine goodness kindness, love, grace, decency, mercy, and forgiveness, if they can be conceptualized at such a grand level that they leave us hugely wanting and accountable in our pursuits of an excellence that always remains out of reach, then this should actually leave us more curious about concepts of divine goodness, not less curious. If such highly sought concepts of divine goodness and kindness and love and mercy, etc., if they're examples of those laws that are impossible to obey, then they're the opposite of totalitarianism. They're not the essential principles of it, as Hitchens claims. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is one of Hitchens' most famous and the one of which he's most proud, or one of the most proud, I think. He says, "Name me an ethical statement made or an action performed by a believer that could not have been made or performed by a non-believer." Now, as I said, it's one of his most highly valued and widely syndicated challenges, and one of which he must be immensely proud given the regularity with which he uses it in his videos. But to be honest, I never got why it was so popular. It doesn't seem well thought through to me, especially once you understand that morality is an evolved phenomenon to which both theists and atheists have access, and on which both base their ethical framework. Even if there is no ethical statement made or an action performed by a believer that could not have been made or performed by a non-believer, that doesn't say anything at all about the case for or against Christianity. I think Hitchens' question shows a lack of understanding of what religious belief entails, and also the overlooking of something that should be, I think, trivially obvious, which is that a proper analysis involves much more than just the statement or the action. It involves analyzing the beliefs, the intentions, the humility, the motive, and other psychological factors that did not come out in the mere action. So I think we could name good moral actions taken by both religious and non-religious people that have produced the same result, sure. But that doesn't tell us anything about what is directing the action or whether the person is living a godly life. And it certainly has no bearing on whether there is a God or not. So again, it's a failure of Christopher Hitchens to make a point that's very meaningful, despite the fact that he loves it so much, it seems. So he says, on our integrity, the next quote, our basic integrity, knowing right from wrong and being able to choose a right action over a wrong one, I think one must repudiate the claim that one doesn't have this moral discrimination innately, that no, it must come only from the agency of, his favorite word again, celestial dictatorship, which one must love and simultaneously fear. Human decency is not derived from religion, it precedes it. Well, this is the same category of argumentation, of bad argumentation, and as the previous one. Hitchens often he makes this kind of argument, but it's simply it's an example of him continually stating the obvious and appealing to a false dichotomy to which most theists themselves don't fall victim. No sensible believer thinks that human decency, goodness, and moral thinking derives from religion. Quite the contrary. It's only when we are disposed to morality that theistic interpretations of God have any power at all. That Christopher Hitchens continually makes this desperate appeal as part of his regular repertoire. It suggests to me he's just trying to blind his followers with spurious appeals to the ridiculous. I mean, nobody sensible thinks that morality comes from religion, and that without it we wouldn't know what morality is or be able to make moral decisions. So another bad failing. And again, as I said, I'm not just cherry picking the worst stuff. This is the stuff he comes out with all the time. Next slide is Another one of his regular statements made in videos: what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Well, where do we start with this? To express fully what's wrong with this statement, it would probably take a whole video in itself, but just briefly, it grossly caricatures religious faith to state that it is asserted without evidence. I mean, in reality, evidence is in the eye of the beholder, and different people accept and interpret different evidence as differently. That's, maybe some people are too easily seduced by interpretations that shouldn't ever be offered as reasons for belief in God. Sure, I'll accept that. But equally, there are going to be lots of people whose psychological agitations predispose them to a skepticism that demands too much evidence, or the wrong kind of evidence, or doesn't have a proper grasp of what would make good evidence. And, I suspect Christopher Hitchens' main problem is that he'd never thought through properly what evidence for God actually means and how it might be different from the more simplistic evidence found in, say, empirical science. Never once did I hear Christopher Hitchens tell us what he thinks good evidence is. What makes evidence good? What makes good evidence good as opposed to bad evidence? How does belief in God differ from knowledge of the empirical world, and what Christopher Hitchens thinks would be satisfactory evidence for God? As I said at the beginning, his arguments and his rhetoric is very shallow, I find. He doesn't say any of those things. He doesn't even attempt to engage with them. He just passes them off with witty statements, and he's a good crowd pleaser. But this stuff is, as I said, it's really shallow and very philosophically anemic. As I stated in a recent video on God's evidence, to which I'll put a link in the description to that too. People who just use the term evidence in such clumsy, ill-defined ways are showing us, they're begging us to see that they don't want to engage in the subject with the true depth and gravitas it requires. And I'm afraid that Christopher Hitchens epitomized that. Next slide, let's have a look. So philosophy begins where religion ends, just as by analogy, chemistry begins where alchemy runs out, and astronomy takes the place of astrology. Again, it might be the sort of thing that he would say on stage to get a laugh, but really the analogy of alchemy and astrology to their better counterparts it's so misjudged in relation to religion's relationship with philosophy. I mean, philosophy doesn't begin where religion ends. Religious inquiry is a key part of philosophy, because the question of how we inquire it's essential to what we conclude, and that is evidently true of Christopher Hitchens' anti-religion and his inquiries about religion too. In saying philosophy begins where religion ends, Hitchens he excuses himself from having to give God and the subject of religion and the debate about religion and God's existence a proper analysis. For a man who was so verbose on the subject, I think he said so few things of any profundity, really. It's like I said earlier, he makes so many empty statements that are couched in wit and verbal eloquence. But I think for many, the sheer philosophical barrenness of the content passed many of his listeners by. They must have done, because he was clearly so popular. So next statement, last quote actually of his, I think: to believe in a God is in one way to express a willingness to believe in anything. Again, I've heard him say that several times, so I think it's fair to pick that one as an example. It's difficult to do justice to how absurd that statement is. It just isn't true, is it? I mean, in fact, I doubt there was a single person who's ever lived who believed or believes in God, but yet showed a willingness to believe in anything. Really, that's what Hitchens thinks. The statement Hitchens made, it's so far from reality and so far from sound philosophical thinking that it shows beyond any doubt, I think, that he has always been out of his depth on the subject of religion. I don't know whether he was any good at arithmetic, but if we were to quantify the two sets, things believed in and things not believed in, and then work out how many things there are that are believed in differently between theists and atheists, and then work out the number of things that both the theist and the atheist do not believe in, I'm certain that the differences in the latter would amount to a much higher number than the differences in the former. And as I've said in many blogs and videos, that the only God you find atheists are rejecting, almost always anyway, is the kind of God with a small g that almost no sensible theist believes in anyway. And that's a key point that should be said about most atheists. All Christopher Hitchens is saying really is to believe in the kind of God I have in mind is in one way to express a willingness to believe in anything. That's actually how you should translate that statement. And given the kind of absurd caricature Hitchens creates as a god with a small g in order to reject the straw man god to knock down. I just think he's given the kind of absurd caricature Hitchens creates. I think it would make a. I think I would make a different statement. And if you're the sort of person who can create such unrepresentative gods in order to reject them, and such lazily thought through commentary on the Christian faith, you probably show a willingness to believe many absurd things. Yeah, I think that's how I would phrase that. So, as I said, I've tried to pick Hitchens at his best and most popular. I said the same thing about Dawkins, and I'll say the same about Hitchens. There are a lot of Christians, so-called Christians, a lot of people who are agnostic and on the fence who claim to have fallen away from the faith based on the books and arguments of Hitchens and Dawkins. Well, my view is if you really could be argued out of belief so easily by such mediocre thinkers, then your beliefs and your arguments for the propositions of God probably weren't very strong in the first place. So, in closing, I think, Hitchens, again, witty guy, fun to watch, but repeatedly tells us why he thinks God does not exist with those aforementioned witty and clever sound bites. But frankly, the distortions, the straw man caricatures, and the poor reasoning are, in my view, so clumsy that it really beggars belief that so many people held him up as a spokesperson for reason and rationality on matters of faith. I have a rule of thumb which I sometimes share. It's basically this: it's the God one accepts or denies is only likely to be as intellectually tenable as the intellectual tenability of the person holding those ideas. So that's how you should perhaps look at unbelievers when they're talking about God and see how intellectually tenable they are in the statements they're making. If you want to think seriously about the existence of God, and it does require a lot of serious thought and complex and depth and deep analysis, you can do a lot better than Christopher Hitchens. I think that's probably enough said. Let me stop sharing that screen. Thank you for watching and hope it was helpful. I will put the links I mentioned in the description along with a link to my blog. And thank you for watching and thank you for your support in my being able to make these videos. Please do like and subscribe because it makes all the difference. And hopefully we can build up a bit of a following and a relationship together, and then we can do many more things. So I've been James Knight, also known as the Philosophical Muser, and I will put the links in the description below. Thank you, and see you on the next video.